I want to thank the St. Jerome's Guild for inviting me to deliver this book review. I will be reviewing the book On the Road with Saint Augustine by James K.A. Smith. And for my review, I have a PowerPoint or a keynote presentation to accompany my talk. So I will share this with you now. On the Road with Saint Augustine, a real world spirituality for restless hearts by James K.A. Smith. If I can use one word to describe this entire book, I would say the book is relevant. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. I'll tell you what I mean when I say this book is relevant. The book is written with a deep understanding of the life and insights of St. Augustine. So, this book is steeped in the spirituality of a 4th century saint from Africa. And yet, the entire book is relevant to each and every one of us. Those of us living in the 21st century, it's timeless in truth. The book is relevant to any one of us living in Kerrville, Texas. Maybe you are in the majority demographic as a retiree in Kerrville, Texas. Nonetheless, this book can be relevant to a millennial living in Manhattan. Yes, this book implies an Augustinian spirituality, and that sounds churchy and it sounds ancient. But the book is really for somebody who is on the road. It could be for somebody about to go through a midlife crisis. Before you buy the convertible, I would say read this book. You need to read this book. It can also be for the girl who graduates from Ozona High School. That girl might be itching to move to New York City the day after she graduates from Ozona High, thinking she will find joy and happiness in the big city. This book is for every soul trying to find his or her way home. And yes, a 4th century saint from Africa has much to teach every one of us. My heart is restless until it rests in you, God, St. Augustine so famously said. On the Road with St. Augustine is relevant because this book can speak to every human with a heartbeat. Furthermore, this book is relevant in how the author brilliantly engages with pop culture, particularly film. Smith regularly peppers his profound points with references to scenes in movies. He has the skill to identify certain cultural references that tap into our deeper longings as human beings. We humans long to find ourselves, we long to find our true home. We're on the road. Much of literature and film are about this metaphorical journey. Is it self-discovery? Is it finding true happiness? Don't we remember classic movies about the iconic road? Smith says the road is iconic because it is the symbol of liberation. From On the Road to Easy Rider to Thelma and Louise, the road is a ribbon that wins away from convention, obligation, and the oppression of domesticity. Get on the road. Let your hair down. Thelma says to Louise, "You said that you and me were going to get out of town and for once just really let our hair down. Well, darling, look out because my hair is coming down." St. Augustine, he tried this and he learned a lot of things on the road, on the journey. For me, this book raises 3 questions for all of us. Where are you headed? How far must you go to get to where you're headed? And who is along for the ride? The first question, where are you headed? For some, they just don't know where they're headed. Now, we can all laugh. Yes, we've probably heard it said or said it ourselves. That generation, those types, they just don't know where they're headed. We grumble about where others might be headed. But this is an important question for ourselves. This is a very important spiritual matter. Where are you headed? We lead lives on the outside based on our interior orientation. We all need to know where we are headed. And Smith makes the argument that all of us, to some degree, have been shaped by the myth that the road is life. Now, you might be asking, what does this mean? Well, this means that we are told to just stay on the move for self discovery and the pursuit of happiness. It's the belief that you never get to an ultimate destination. Smith writes, to be on the way is to have arrived. Ignore the feeling of sadness only bus stations have. Ignore the nights of despair and move on. Don't get too hung up on your recognition that Los Angeles is the loneliest and most brutal of American cities. The trick is to convince yourself that the road is life, making restlessness peace, uprootedness home. Here, Smith uses an illustration from the film Up in the Air. In the movie, Ryan Bingham, played by George Clooney, has shed all attachments, both material and relational. Ryan Bingham lives on airplanes and is, quote unquote, at home in airports. His quest is not a destination, but incessant journeying. He wants to be a million miler. And there is a poignant scene toward the end of the movie when George Clooney has achieved his goal in life to become a million miler. Clooney is on the plane. They're in flight. The cabin's full, and the stewardess comes over the intercom to announce the captain's congratulations to Ryan Bingham. Everybody applauds. The stewardess brings him a glass of champagne, and the captain, played by Sam Elliott, enters the cabin and makes his way to Bingham to congratulate him in person. Captain Elliott, I'll call him, takes a seat next to Ryan Bingham. This is quite the accomplishment, achieving this million miler status. And Captain Elliott says, we appreciate your loyalty. And then he asks, so where are you from? Bingham can only reply, I'm from here. The hollowness rings in his own ears. He doesn't have a home. He's up in the air. The road is life. So are we stuck in the rat race? Do we have a home? Are we headed nowhere? Is it just a road? Well, remember the title of the book, On the Road with Saint Augustine. A bit of background on Augustine. Maybe this will be a refresher for some of you. Augustine was born in 354 in the small North African town of Thagaste. His mother, Monica, was a Christian, but his father, Patricius, was a pagan. Augustine was made a catechumen at a young age. His mother wanted to raise him in the Christian faith, so he was made a catechumen at a young age, but the Christian faith of his mother did not take. Augustine showed signs of intellectual brilliance early on in his life. He was schooled in rhetoric and Latin literature at a very young age, attending schools in nearby Madorus and Carthage. So he's on the road and he goes to Madurus and Carthage. In his youth, he was well on his way to intellectual success. He was on the road. If you know his story, he really let his hair down. At the age of 17, when he lost his faith, and Augustine took a concubine with whom he lived for 15 years, they had a son together. And so he was on the road. He was always growing in his intellectual prowess, and he became disillusioned with the old Latin Bible style and content. One might say he was disinterested in the Christianity of his mother. This led him to entertain worldly philosophies, particularly Manichaeism, an elaborate belief system describing the dualistic struggle between the good spiritual world of light and the evil material world of darkness. Augustine subscribed to Manichaeism for a decade of time, all the while moving up the ladder of the academy. He passed through successive teaching posts at Carthage, and then he went to Rome, and then he went to Milan. There's much more to Augustine's story in regards to his family life and his human experience, but something happened in Milan that would change the course of Augustine's journey, and it would make a dramatic impact on the rest of Western civilization for that matter. When Augustine arrived to Milan, he began to listen to the sermons delivered by the Bishop of Milan, Saint Ambrose. Initially, Augustine listened to Ambrose's sermons for their rhetorical power, but after hearing his sermons, he began to truly listen. And Augustine eventually became friends with Bishop Ambrose. Augustine was loved by Bishop Ambrose, and in somewhat of a dramatic fashion, Augustine converted to the Christian faith. This was the hope and dream of his mother, and we'll come back to their relationship. In July 386, in a garden in Milan, Augustine came to a decision to abandon secular hopes, his career in rhetoric and marriage. He arrived to his true home, to Christ. On Easter Eve 387, Augustine was baptized by Bishop Ambrose, and he was home. In Christ, Augustine had arrived at his destination. Granted, Augustine lived another 43 years after his adult baptism. He would become a priest and then a bishop. He was prolific and he would become the doctor of the church. But after reading On the Road with St. Augustine, here's the takeaway for us, I think. Where are you headed? Augustine finds the answer to this question. This fourth century saint from North Africa is relevant to us precisely because his story is not unique. Smith says Augustine's story is only of interest if it is unoriginal. A story that's been told a million times, one that rehearses the prodigal adventures of the human condition. The prodigal son thought he would find his home by leaving his father's house and traveling to a distant country. And now the folks in Hollywood have made millions or billions of dollars writing screenplays based on the parables found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. Ryan Bingham thought the road is life. He thought you could just keep going. And God knows that will wear you out. The rat race, whatever you want to call it. But Augustine discovered the gospel. He discovered the good news. There is a place prepared for us, to use Jesus's words from the Gospel of John. Augustine discovered where we are headed if we truly want to find our way home. Where are you headed? Smith gives us three ways by which we can understand this metaphorical journey. Journey number one, it's a classic, the Odyssean journey. Homer's Odyssey. This template is circular. Smith describes it concisely. You depart, you go away, and you return home. The homecoming is getting back to the start. It's a neat and tidy return. That's the Odyssean journey. Then there's a second template. This is the Sisyphean journey. In 1942, in the age of industrialization and a world at war, Albert Camus wrote a famous essay titled The Myth of Sisyphus. In the essay, he upholds the model of Sisyphus, who was doomed to roll a rock up a hill to try to get it over the top, only to have it roll back to the bottom every single time. Camus took Sisyphus's situation to be emblematic of the human condition, Smith says. Basically, we are called to try to do something, to hope for something that could never actually be accomplished. So, what he says is that we're to learn to love the failure, embrace the failure. Camus claims that when Sisyphus acknowledges the futility of his task and the certainty of his fate, he's then freed to realize the absurdity of his situation and to reach a state of contented acceptance. With a nod to the similarly cursed Greek hero Oedipus, Camus concludes that all is well indeed, that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And he'll write in the book, Smith will, according to the Sisyphean journey, you can find peace and happiness and learning to get over your hope for home. But Smith reminds us that there is another way to understand the journey. There's a third way, the refugee journey. We can take another template of the journey for the refugee. The refugee is trying to get to the other shore, trying to get across the border, trying to get over the fence. And Smith will ask, how hopeful does Camus in the myth of Sisyphus sound in that context? You will never arrive. It's the message, I know you won't get there and you'll never arrive. You may want to go there, but you'll never arrive. It doesn't sound very hopeful. However, in contrast to the Odyssean journey, the refugee is trying to find a home you've never been to. It's not a neat and tidy return. Smith points out that Augustine uses a Latin word in many of his writings, particularly in the City of God. He uses the word peregrinus. Usually that word is translated in English as pilgrim. So we could think about a pilgrimage, and that could be an okay translation. However, that does not appreciate the peregrinus is also a fugitive, a migrant. It's more like a refugee in the sense of being human is actually to be longing and hoping to get to a home, even though you've never been to that home before. Instead of it being a return to a homeland, it is actually an arrival in a homeland that you've never even lived in. And yet, once you get there, you realize you are home. And so Smith points out that Augustine thinks this is the human condition. We're created with this inbuilt hunger for a home we've never been to. We are created parallel to the refugees and migrants today. Spiritually, there is a hope for us, and the journey is difficult for all of us. We're all on this journey. We all share the same story, and that we all long to get somewhere. And perhaps we're on the refugee journey, spiritually speaking. So Smith asks the question, what if being human means being a cosmic immigrant, vulnerable, exposed, unsettled, desperate, looking for a home I've never been to before? I can think of an iconic story from the Bible that illustrates this kind of journey. Moses and the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. That's a long quarantine, but they were not made to stay in the wilderness for the rest of their lives. They were destined for another land. It was a land they had yet to see, but it was the land promised to them and their ancestors, the land flowing with milk and honey. Moses had never set foot into the land promised to him and his ancestors all the way back to Abraham, but he could see the land for which he was ultimately destined. Think back to Augustine. It's interesting how he never arrived home when he was in Rome and Milan. Augustine had the brain power and the intellectual skill to find himself in elite company, no doubt, but he was an African, and Augustine's biographer reminds us even the fully Latinized African of the 4th century remained somewhat alien to the people around him. Moreover, when Augustine returned to Africa, he found himself suspect there as well. After climbing the ranks through the Roman channels of power, his African compatriots thought he might have gone over to the other side. Where are you headed? Smith says, imagine a refugee spirituality and understanding of human longing and estrangement that not only honors those experiences of not at homeness, but also affirms the hope of finding a home, finding oneself. The immigrant is migrating toward a home she's never been to before. She will arrive in a strange land and, in ways that surprise her, come to say, I'm home here, not least because someone is there to greet her and say, welcome home. The goal isn't returning home, but being welcomed home in a place you were not born, arriving in a strange land and being told you belong here. The journey, it's not of settling down in the vagaries of the present or of settling for what you can find. And it's certainly not about living with the fears and injustices that fuel the hunger for elsewhere. It's about knowing how to make the journey, how to adopt the posture of the refugee who travels light. One of my favorite traditions from the ancient church has to be the physical reorientation of the candidates for holy baptism. Before the candidate was baptized, immersed in the waters, he was asked 6 questions. And while he was facing west in the direction of the setting sun, the candidate was asked, do you renounce Satan and all the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God? And he would answer, I renounce them. Do you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? Again, I renounce them. Do you renounce all sinful desires that draw you from the love of God? I renounce them. After renouncing the old way of life, the candidate would physically change direction and reorient himself to face east in the direction of the rising sun. So he would turn, physically turn in the direction of the rising sun. Then he was asked, do you turn to Jesus Christ and accept him as your Savior? And he would answer, I do. Do you put your whole trust in his grace and love? I do. Do you promise to follow and obey him as your Lord? I do. Smith writes, the disciple, as much as anyone, finds herself between on the way, fatigued, yet hopeful. Baptism isn't a capsule that transports us to the end of the road. Conversion is not an arrival at our final destination, it's the acquisition of a compass. Augustine knew this to be true in his baptism. He'll go on to write, Smith will go on to write, Ambrose had led Augustine to the one who is the way, setting him on the road with a new orientation. He emerged from the waters of baptism as an emigre with a new passport, declaring heavenly citizenship. He had miles to go before he'd sleep, but now he knew where home was. Where are you headed? In Christ, we know. The next question this book raises for us is the question, how far must you go to get to where you're headed? Think about Ryan Bingham. He traveled 1 million miles to get the silver card. He was in the Million Miler Club. When Captain Sam Elliott gave Bingham his card, he even said, here you go, 7th card we've made. 7th card. Small club. How far must you go? How many miles must you travel? How many millions must you make? How far must one go? Augustine tried the road is life philosophy, but that was not the truth. And Augustine moved up the ranks even as he made his way north from Carthage to Rome to Milan. But he didn't have to go very far, actually, to find his true home. And this is the truth his mother, Monica, back in North Africa, this is the truth his mother, Monica, always knew. Smith helps us see how 2 worlds would collide for Augustine when his mother Monica arrives in Milan, and she is not only accepted but even praised by Ambrose. Remember, Augustine was wowed by Ambrose's preaching. He heard a Christianity that he had never entertained, a faith with intellectual firepower that could stand toe to toe with any philosophy. And then Monica shows up with her simple African faith, and Ambrose sees how Monica understands the faith and he praises her for her devotion. Monica had a maturity in the faith that Augustine did not have when he was well educated, but a baby Christian. How far must you go? Ha! What kind of question is that? The story of Augustine and Monica will tug at your heartstrings. She is Saint Monica. Augustine was baptized on Easter Eve 387, and his mother Monica would die later that year. After Augustine had been baptized, Augustine and Monica would set out for their return to Africa, and Monica would die along their way home. Smith writes, ultimately, Monica shows Augustine how to go home, even she'd never see Africa again. In his song of praise to Monica in Book 9 of the Confessions, one of the most moving eulogies in Western literature, Augustine recounts their conversation that became an ascent to the divine they both craved. Augustine as a Neoplatonist, Monica as one who, quite apart from philosophy, had long looked for another country. After a lengthy land journey from Milan, they withdrew from the bustling crowds of Ostia, busy in commerce and pagan devotion, to rest up for the voyage back to Africa. In his quietude, looking over the garden, they mused together, not nostalgically about Thagasse, Augustine's hometown, but about what it would be like in that heavenly city where the sun is the light, S-O-N, sun, where the sun is the light. They found themselves transported to the extent that Monica turned to her son and asked, "So what am I doing here?" "I'm ready to go," she as much said. Not back home across the Mediterranean once again, but to the home she sighed for which she was homesick because she'd just caught a glimpse of it. Augustine's refugee spirituality is something he learned from Monica. Augustine's brother was perplexed by Monica's nonchalance about her homeland as she approached death. And Augustine will recall, my brother said something about hoping she would pass away not in a foreign country, but in her native one. But she scolded him with her eyes, as only mothers can do. Soon afterward, she said to both of us, "Bury this body anywhere you like. Nothing is far from God. And there's no reason to fear that when the world ends, he won't know the place from which to resurrect me," she joked. How far must you go to get to where you are headed? Not far. Actually, we're all prodigals, and the Father runs to greet us before we could even get to the front door. Augustine would come to know this truth more fully in his Christian faith. Ambrose shared the gospel with Augustine. Smith writes, more than arguments or proofs, Ambrose offered the seeker Augustine something he'd been hungering for, a home, sanctuary, rest. For this refugee in a new city, arriving with questions and with so much unsettled in his life, the cathedral in Milan became an outpost of the home this spiritual emigre had been seeking. And there was a father there waiting to welcome him. We don't have to go very far. God has come to us, and this is one of the greatest truths of the Christian faith. For us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. 3 questions for us. Where are we headed? How far must you go to get there? Who is along for the ride? Thank God for mothers like Monica. She prayed so fervently for her son. His mother was always along for the ride. And there are others along for the ride. There's an entire chapter in this book on friendship. Augustine placed a great value on friendship. Did you know that when Augustine was made a bishop, one of the conditions he stipulated was that he be permitted to found a monastic community of clergy who would live with him in the bishop's residence? He needed friends. He knew the need for friends. He needed someone riding shotgun, so to speak. He had a strong friendship with others. He had a strong friendship with Alypius, especially. In the chapter on friendship, Smith comments on what he calls the true friend. This would be someone who is with you and someone who might challenge you to answer your call in life. We may not know what we are to become without friends, and they're with us riding shotgun. In terms of his own conversion narrative, Augustine's friends actually prodded and prompted him to answer the call. This piece of art shows Augustine struggling with his conversion, and the other person in the painting is Alypius. He too struggled with coming to the faith. So perhaps true friends can help us to become more authentic. Again, Smith uses film to illustrate what we might discover in the life and confessions of Saint Augustine. Smith makes reference to a scene in one of my favorite movies, Goodwill Hunting. Chucky, played by Ben Affleck, is Will Hunting's best friend. Will Hunting, played by Matt Damon. They're close friends, and Chucky prods Will Hunting to be true to his calling in life. Will resists his destiny, you might say, but Chucky believes Will Hunting has a gift. He's a genius and he needs to go somewhere. Chucky and Will work in construction, and after a hard day on the job, they crack a beer and Chucky prods his friend to venture out. And in prodding his friend, I'm not so sure that means Chucky plans to leave Will on his own. I trust he wants to remain his friend, stick by his side. Chucky says to Will, "Look, you're my best friend, so don't take this the wrong way. But in 20 years, if you're still living here, coming over to my house, watching Patriots games, still working construction, I'll blank kill you." Apparently, they use some foul language in the movie. But Chucky wants to see his friend flourish. And he says to him, "You're sitting on a winning lottery ticket and not willing to cash it in." Who is along for the ride? Smith writes, "The true friend is the other who hopes you'll answer the call, who is willing to challenge you and upset you in order to get you to look at yourself and ask yourself, what am I doing? What do I love? Who am I?" The true friend is the other who has the courage to impose a conviction, who paints a substantive picture of the good, who prods and prompts you to change course and chase it, and promises to join you on the way. Where do you find your friends? Is a friend on Facebook really a friend? Or is your friend from your Emmaus or Curcio reunion group? Is it a friend from Bible study? Is it a friend in recovery? Smith points out the fact that we can find friends like this, especially in the church, true friends. Who is along for the ride? Thank God for mothers like Monica, friends like Alypius, spiritual fathers like Ambrose. We're not alone on the road home. I've only scratched the surface in what you can gain from reading this book. Smith speaks to a variety of topics in the book, all coming back, I think, to this idea of a refugee spirituality. I recommend that you read this book. It's a book for you. It's a book for everybody, precisely because Augustine's story is unoriginal. It is the story scripted for every restless soul searching for her home. This last piece of art hangs in the Seattle Art Museum. Saint Augustine in Ecstasy. You cannot see them in this image, but Augustine is surrounded by books at his feet. You can see his bishop's mitres off to the side, and you can see his staff, his bishop's staff, leaning in the corner. His arms are outstretched, and a light illumines his face. In the upper left corner, we can read the inscription in Latin. In Augustine's own words, "My heart is restless until it rests in you." Smith says everyone is looking for rest, which is just another way of saying we're looking for an identity, a story that gives us the swagger of being known, named, and offered a map home. Yes, read this book and connect with a saint in the church, connect with all the saints who know where they are headed. Jesus Christ is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Again, I want to thank the St. Jerome's Guild for the invitation to offer this book review. I hope they'll ask me again. And grace and peace to all of you. Thank you.